I'm Ron Van Cleef, 5-time world champion, 15-time All-American, the Black Dragon. And my teacher, Moses Powell, was a really superior jiu-jitsu practitioner. I mean, really superior. He was the first black man to teach the FBI. He was Malcolm X's bodyguard. I mean, he was somebody, you know? I mean, he was really... Imagine I met him when I was 15. I was, you know, holy. I stayed with him until I went in service. I wanted to be a Marine, and I joined the Marine Corps when I was stationed in North Carolina. First night in boot camp, one guy pissed on me when I was sleeping. I gave this guy a beating, and I'm confronted by about 20 like farmer-type guys with shovels, pitchforks, all that kind of stuff. They beat me up. They knocked 4 teeth out. They broke my jaw. They broke 5 ribs. They cracked my sternum. They broke my left arm at the elbow and turned around backwards and stomped on it. I almost lost my left eye. And then they hung me. They put a rope around my neck and pulled me up in the air. And I blacked out. The last thing I saw was someone swinging a shovel toward my face. And after 4 months of, you know, in the hospital, they decided to send me to Vietnam. My captain said that we didn't get you here, but we'll have the Gooks get you. I saw a lot of racism in Vietnam, a lot, more than what I thought I would, because the same white cracker officers and NCOs from North Carolina were having black guys go out on these no-return missions, you know what I mean? I served in Vietnam 14 months. I was a gunner on a helicopter, and Vietnam damaged my mind. It took me many, many years. I can't even say to recover, just to not live in survivor mode. So the martial arts was my only escape.
Long before martial, a Roman god of war, and long before the Asian art defense system, the origin of all of that came right here in Kemet. It was called the Mantu. The Mantu art form was an African defense system, long before a Roman god of war called martial art. Here you see another art form, even using the sticks and the art form. The one we look at is some kind of a karate chop. And then you see a flip that's taking place right here. So here you see, right, what they call judo. Here you see a flip right here, and also another form of the art with the brothers are trying to defeat the other and bring him down. So here you see an African defense system, but I want to show you that this is an African origin that goes as far back as the Nubas. Now, keep in mind that that came from the Nubas, brothers and sisters. It was an African defense system, meaning that in this African defense system, you see the same exact thing right here. Now look at this here form right here, and look at these brothers from Nuba. Look how far back this goes. This is the same type of African defense system that is going on right now with the Nubas that you see with these two brothers right here, to show it's an African art form all the way from the Nubas. The Nubas who live in the highlands of the Sudan. Now, also, just as you see these two brothers right here, mixing it up, one trying to flip the other down, and look at the Nuba brother that you see right here. Okay? So that's why we come back in all forms to show our story so we can document it, not just to have it from a European perspective, but have it from our African perspective, our African Kemetic perspective. So we see the two African defense system right here. Now keep in mind, when these brothers, why are they in this form of art right here with the Nubas anyway? They're fighting for something. They're fighting for the woman. And the Ta-Nehisi Kushite Ethiopians are also received from the art. And these blades or rings are around their hand that they use for fights. But let's go and see, when I was in the Bume village of Ethiopia, here January 6th, we see our brother is wearing the band around his hand to use for fights for the Bume. But his culture, you see him here, it goes all the way back to the Kushite nation. And on the temples of Kemet, you can see the African defense system and see that that culture started with African people and karate and all these things today, as you see the flips and so forth and the hands. And also you can see the arrow where we see the stick fighting that he's also using on the temple, but you see it right there on the temples of Egypt over 3,000 years ago. These are books in stone that our ancestors left us. And you see them with the stick figures for the fighting right here. Also, we see go among the Nuba, who their wrestling styles and compare their wrestling styles are identical to those are right there in Kemet. So we can see it on the temples of Kemet, and we can see the wrestling styles are identical to what you see in ancient Kemet. As when we went into the village, and the Bume village in southern Ethiopia, the Karo as well. And we can see our brother right here, Kisa, who came with us. He's one of the brothers I selected to come into this region of Ethiopia. And you see him with our brother right here with the ring around his hand, the defense system. And Brother Kisa went to fight with him. I said, brother, you can't mess with that, brother. He got a blade on his hand. He went through a quick move and blood started running all down his arm. Okay, so it was a quick move, but the brother was just defending himself because Kisa was trying to do something fast on him. But the brother was ready for him. But you can see where his culture is still passed down from the ancient Kushites. As we see the Ta-Nehisi Kushite soldiers from the land of the bow of Taseti. And we see them here because it is here that they excavated Mentuhotep's temple and got these soldiers. But notice that they're holding the sticks for battle right here. So when we go back to Musi land, and we can see the same culture among the Musi, the Donga sticks that they use for fights. That are used, but you see them in the Cairo Museum among the Ta-Nehisi.
The crucial task of reconstructing history has been hampered by centuries of distortions and omissions, with the ultimate goal of keeping the truth hidden. A famous historian once said, "The missing pages of African history are the missing pages of world history." Therefore, it is important to understand the most valuable asset of a historic people is their past. Consequently, we should treat our history just like any other situation where something of high value has been stolen. Archaeology is the science of reconstructing history. In the last 100 years, scientists have discovered some remains that should change prevailing misconceptions about world history. Archaeologists act as ancient detectives that work to uncover the mystery of his story. Evidence is discovered through a careful study of artifacts and fossils. Artifacts are human-made objects. Fossils are preserved organic remains, like bones, teeth, and hair. Some of the earliest fossils were found in the Great Lakes region around the Omo Valley on the east coast of Africa. Organic life must be pigmented and black to be sustainable in that warm environmental condition. The Gloger law calls for warm-blooded animals to be pigmented in a hot and humid climates. This is scientific evidence to the fact that all other races of this planet derive from the black Africans. Theories that suggest humanity started somewhere else have been proven invalid. Other continents were populated from Africa about 75,000 years ago. Or as Dr. John Henry Clark used to say, once those Africans got their act together, they took their show on the road. So it should not be shocking when someone mentions the fact that the first Asians were African. But don't take my word for it. Let's hear what the Chinese have to say about their history.
However, there is something that could settle this debate of where the Chinese come from once and for all. I'm meeting Professor Jin Li, one of China's leading geneticists. Recently, he led a project that set out to prove that the Chinese evolved independently from everyone else, from Homo erectus, here in China.
Before the project started, I was hoping that I could identify or could be able to find evidence that support independent origin of Chinese in China, because I'm a Chinese and came from China, and through the education process, I always believed that there's something special about Chinese.
He singled out a male genetic marker which only appeared about 80,000 years ago in Africa. So any man who carries that marker must have recent African ancestors and can't be descended from the more ancient Asian Homo erectus. Jin took DNA from over 160 ethnic groups around East Asia. Over 12,000 samples. And so, what did you find?
We did not see even one single individual that could be considered as the descendant of the Homo erectus in China. Rather, everybody was a descendant of our ancestors from Africa.
The result couldn't have been any clearer. And how did that make you feel as a Chinese person?
After I saw the evidences that we generate in my laboratory, I think we should all be happy with that, because after all, modern humans from different part of the world are not so different from each other, and we are very close relatives.
The Kalahari Desert, Namibia. I'm here to find an extraordinary ancient tribe of people, the San Bushmen. Our research shows that their distant relatives left Africa and set in motion the family tree of mankind. From them stemmed every color, creed, and nationality alive today. Everything predicted in their blood seems to be written in their faces. It's like looking at a composite model of every face from around the world. The eye shape of East Asians, the high cheekbones of Mongolians, the mid-brown skin that could turn darker or lighter.
So the San, also called Bushmen, and these are very ancient people whose history in southern Africa is perhaps 40,000 years old or more, probably older than that. I would expect more like 100,000 years. Now, 10 or 15 years ago, showing this image, I would have said that that they look like East Asians, like Chinese, like Koreans, etc. But now I would say that East Asians look like them. And there's a good reason for that, because these folk like this are the original people of Africa and Asia, or at least very ancient people. And then we see something very similar with this San woman right here. And this is interesting because it shows that not all black people are dark. Some black people are naturally light-skinned. It has nothing to do with racial intermingling. Again, we're talking about the original man, the original woman, original humanity, black coming out of Africa.
The Nile River, which we came down, flows from south to north. See, we came down the river. They came up the river. So when we came down in this direction, we looked at this as the bottom. This is the bottom. And see, a lot of the ancient fossils is in the Central East region of Africa, but they left this region and went south before they came down north. You'll find a lot of ancient artifacts in South Africa. So they went south before they came north. And so all these civilizations down here, even India.
Now, this is the first world right here. This is the first world, okay? This is the reason you think it's upside down, but it's not. It's top side up. See, because our people came down the river, okay? We came down the river. So Europe and all Upper Asia is on the bottom to our people. That's why when you read Egyptian history, this is Lower Egypt, and up here is Upper Egypt. This is Lower Sudan, this is Upper Sudan, because they're considering this the top, okay, when you do your research. And so our peoples was I'm going to deal with the monsoons. You got the moms in India. See, those are those wind currents. And I'm going to show you the months where it blows towards India, okay? They blowing hard, too. So you can bring large commodities during these times, and then for 4 or 5 months, they switch and go back to Africa. So our peoples was coming, this is what you call the Southern Hemisphere. And our peoples was coming across these oceans tens of thousands of years ago. You're coming into Australia, coming into what you call Indonesia, coming into, what they call the Polynesia and all these crazy ass words, just to keep from calling it African people. Okay, this is right side up for people just can't take this way. They say, God damn it, I don't want to say that. I know what you're talking about, but in case you need to see it this way, okay? And so again, the monsoons is coming up the Mozambique Channel, and they blowing all through here, what they call the Arabian Sea, and if you put any boat in it, it's going to land you right into India, automatically. And if you come low enough, it'll shoot you up under and come over here into the Bay of Bengal. These are the monsoons, the winds in July, okay? And it's showing you the winds that's blowing all through here, okay? And so these Africans was coming over here a long time ago, family. We talking about we talking about 10,000 years before the white man even showed up. We was always, so this was Kush. So when you hear Nagar, which this is Naga land, but I'm going to show you where it's all throughout the culture. The Twa, and that's where the Twa stay at. The little short, which y'all call, what the Western world call pygmies. This is where they stay, most of them stay at right now today, the rainforest. They was the first one that gathered the medicine. They was there for hundreds of millions of years. This is where they was. And these was the little Twa and the San people. You know them, they call them Bushmen. They got that real short, tight, curly hair, and they got slant eyes. And they was the first two types that went out all over the world. The Chinese with the slant eye, they come out of the Bushmen, okay? And so the woolly head types was all through this area. Now, you can see the techniques. This is at Angkor Wat, and I'm going there, and that's Angkor. Angkor. You can hear the words. You can hear them. And see, when you're looking at this type of technology, this is over thousands of years of development. You can't do this in a day. So just like if anybody in the world want to take architecture, there's only so many schools. Like a skyscraper downtown, there's only so many schools that can teach you how to build skyscrapers. It's the same with this. These people had to go to school to learn how to carve like this. There's no doubt about it. And so what schools was on the planet at that time still teaching people how to carve stone like that? And you can see right here, this ain't solid. This solid. This got splits in it. See, they can piece that together. That ain't even solid. You can see the cracks of it. That's not solid. So it's as beautiful as it is. We honor our brothers and sisters in Asia that built that, but it still can't.
Now this image takes us to another part of Asia, and one of my favorite places in Asia, and of course this black woman is from Cambodia, and specifically she is called an Apsara. You spell it A-P-S-A-R-A, and she adorns the temple walls of the largest temple complex in mainland Southeast Asia, that temple complex being Angkor Wat. And this is what the images on the outside of the temple look like. Black women with what we would today call locks or braids, big, beautiful lips made for kissing, and the nose is knocked off. And again, this is very similar to what we see in ancient Egypt. We'll have to do a presentation at some point that focuses on the missing noses of African people. This image also is in Angkor Wat Temple, but instead of the outside walls, this is in the Holy of Holies. This is the innermost sanctuary of Angkor Wat Temple. And this is a bodhisattva. This is a person who has received or who has achieved a state of enlightenment similar to the Buddha himself. But a bodhisattva is different from a Buddha in the sense that the bodhisattva has chosen to remain among the world of men and women to help others achieve enlightenment, achieve nirvana. And here you can see a coal black image with happy-to-be-nappy hair and Africoid features. And this is how the deity is worshipped in Cambodia. This is my actual photograph. You can go there and you can see Buddhist nuns and Buddhist monks prostrate themselves before this deity. This is one of my favorite images from Southeast Asia, if not the world itself. And this image is again in Cambodia, I would say perhaps 10 miles from the Angkor Wat Temple. This is the entrance to an ancient city in Cambodia built by a group of people called the Khmers, who adored their beautiful black skin, burnished bronze skin they call it. The city is called Angkor Thom, not Uncle Tom, but Angkor Thom. And I took this photograph myself. Now, and again, this is another really important image for me, Renoka Rashidi personally. This is an image of the Buddha from Vietnam, and this one is in a special museum in France called the Musée Guimet. This museum is devoted to nothing but Asian artifacts. And this is an image of the Buddha, I think from the 8th century AD. And I like this image so much that when I go to France and when I go to this museum, I actually come and speak to this image. When I see these images in the museums, it's as though I'm greeting old friends and family members of mine. Indeed, I think I'm an old soul too. But it gives me just tremendous pleasure and a sense of serenity to be in the presence of these images. Now, with these images, this next sequence, we look briefly at the original men and women of Southeast Asia. For example, this is an image of a black man from Vietnam. This is an image of a black woman and her 2 children in Malaysia, and specifically northern Malaysia. I hope to visit Malaysia in 2007, and this is just across the border. These are images of a black woman and her child in southern Thailand. So these are the original people in that part of the world. And then this one, of course, takes us to the Philippines. And all of these black populations, short in stature, make up the original people in that part of the world, and they are slowly disappearing. They're being absorbed into larger populations. It's interesting, too, that the last Miss Filipino, or Miss Philippines in the beauty pageant, was a black woman of short stature just like these. These people are commonly called negritos or eta. These are pejorative words. The word negrito is a word introduced by the Spanish, which simply means little Negro. The word eta is a Tagalog word. The Tagalog are the majority population of the Philippines today. It means filthy. We call them Acta, A-G-T-A, and that's what they call themselves. And the word basically means simply the people, as if they were the original people. They are very clear about who they are and what their history is in the Philippines. And here you find from the Shang dynasty in China an image of a tiger holding a black child. This is made of bronze. This is in the Chinucci Museum in Paris. This museum in Paris has nothing but Chinese artifacts. I have to give Europeans great credit for one thing, if nothing else. They stole a lot. You know, they are thieves par excellence. And it's amazing there are any artifacts left in the countries of origin. This is in the Chinucci Museum in Paris. This is called the Tigress. And it's an image of a tiger, bronze, Shang dynasty, the first dynasty in China, protecting a black child. You can look at the features there. They do not represent the features of the Han Chinese. This is from east of China. Of course, this is an image from Japan. This is an image of Fudo Mayo, F-U-D, Fudo, F-U-D-O, Mayo, M-Y-O. And the name means the immovable one. And Fudo Mayo is one of the 5 wisdom kings in Japanese mythology. He is patron deity of the samurai, the aristocracy of Japan. There are 2 proverbs that have been used to suggest an African presence in Japan, a black presence in Japan, used by no less than the great Dr. Sheikh Anta Diop. This is also from Japan. This is an image of the Buddha. Of course, the story is the Buddha got his tightly curled hair like that. In fact, some people would even tell you that that's not the Buddha's hair. Those naps, those kinks, those knots on his head that seem so obvious to many of us. I was told at a museum in Los Angeles that the reason the Buddha has hair like that is because it was very hot one day. He was sitting under the Bodhi tree, and to protect him from the sun, these snails crawled up on top of his head. Now, I'm the sort of person that doesn't take anything lightly. I went to India. I went to Bodh Gaya. I found the Bodhi tree. I sat under the Bodhi tree for the better part of a day. None of those snails crawled up on top of my head. Perhaps I'm not as pious as the Buddha, but I wanted to test that theory. And even if there were snails on top of his head, I don't know how that would account for the black skin. Maybe he got sunburnt being under the sun, but he also got a big nose. He got wide cheekbones, or what I think Dr. Robinson calls, I think he refers to majestic lips.
The first thing we should do when recovering the missing pages of our history is learn how to interpret history. As a historic people, we must understand that our history is epic and it predates that of Homo sapiens. Historians have broken ancient history into 3 periods: the Paleolithic era, the Mesolithic era, and the Neolithic era. The Paleolithic era is the longest period. This is the time period that human beings went through several changes. If we went back 2.5 million years ago, we would find Homo habilis roaming Africa. Then came Homo erectus, and eventually Homo sapiens. The rise of Homo sapiens in Central Africa some 400,000 years ago started us on this journey that we find ourselves in today. Here we discovered the early humans lived as hunters and gatherers. They used stone tools with single sharp edges to cut and chop. Around 75,000 years ago, the first wave of Africans left Africa and settled other parts of the world. This is referred to as the Australian migration, where we find Africans living in Eastern Asia, Australia, and the surrounding islands. These are the people that built the Unagani complex in Japan, and the first humans to reach the Americas towards the end of the last ice age. During the Mesolithic era, Africans mastered fire and began to use smelting techniques, and with that knowledge they made spears and harpoons with metal tips. The metal tips made hunting a lot easier. In some places, Africans specialized in hunting particular animals. Africans created language. They developed the first alphabet on the planet. For thousands of years, Africans were the only literate people on the planet. And we can't forget about the Twa migration. The Twa, Anu, sometimes called pygmies, are short, dwarfed Africans that possess a wealth of ancient knowledge. They traveled Asia and the world, including the area we call Europe today, sharing new technology like farming and hut building. By 3500 before the Common Era, we find them in northern China, farming silkworms. They are the origins to the ancient leprechaun stories you hear about in Ireland, and they are well documented throughout Japanese history. The Neolithic era is defined by the migration of those great Kushites from East Africa. They are an ancient people, not as old as the Twa, but historic in their own right. They are descendants from a group of Africans that used to live in the northern region of Africa about 10,000 years ago, before it dried up and became the Sahara. The word Sahara means desert. As the desert set in, African people began to migrate to Western Africa and the world. They transported their culture to parts of Asia and used it to civilize people they came in contact with. By 5000 before the Common Era, the Kushites had set up colonies throughout Asia. A few of these colonies have grown to become some of the oldest and most powerful nations in the world today. I'm talking about countries like Saudi Arabia, Iran, India, Turkey, even China. They were all a part of a network called Kushadwipa, all except China. China would be brought into the fold first by the Twa and later by a group of people called the Kushan. The Kushan of China were one of the first group of Kushite explorers to settle China. They were called the Tai Yiti, which means the Great Lunar Race. Remember, the lunar god for the Africans was named Tahuti. The Chinese give credit to their origins of civilization to a man named Huangdi. He was said to have lived in northern China around 2800 before the Common Era. He is given recognition for the invention of writing, law, medicine, and just about every other major component of a civilized society. As fantastic as the Huangdi legend is, it is just a myth. But when we trace the name of Huangdi, we find a Kushite connection. Dr. Clyde Winter's research has revealed his name to be a modern translation. In Old Chinese, his name is Yohai Hundi, and he was a real person that lived in China around 2282 before the Common Era, and he was African. The name Yohai Hundi translates to Hu Nak Kunte, Kunte being a popular clan name amongst the Mende-speaking people of North and West Africa. Hu Nak Kunte helped to lay the foundations for the first dynastic period of China, starting with the Jia dynasty in 2205 before the Common Era. They were the first Kushite dynasty established in China. Then came the Shang Yin dynasty, another dynasty of Kushite origin. After that, the Zhao dynasty was of mixed lineage, and they started a new trend for China. Around 200 of the Common Era, the trend got worse with the Han invasion that changed the look of Eastern Asia. China started to lighten up, pushing the darker-skinned people to the south or to the southern hemisphere. The Ainu would manage to hang around on the outskirts of China on a group of islands we call Japan. The Ainu called them Cipango. In the year 797 of the Common Era, beloved Japanese Emperor Kwame waged war on the Ainu of Cipango. His top general was an African named Sakin Oyu Yino Tamu Ramiro. This brother was the first shogun of Japan. Tamu Ramiro exterminated the Ainu and helped to create the foundation for the nation of Japan. He also founded the Kaiumitsu Dara Temple, which is a popular tourist site in Japan today. While the Ainu were fighting for their lives in Japan, the Kushites were at it again in Southeast Asia, this time in the country known as Cambodia. 700 years ago, it was called Khmer. Now I should be clear about Khmer. Khmer was an African society. These were African people doing an African thing away from home. The culture and high technology was imported directly from East Africa. They built canals and had vast fields for harvesting. The Empire of Khmer built one of the finest temples in all of Asia, called Angkor Wat's. This complex has a large court space and majestic temples. It also has a man-made pond, just like the one at the Temple of Karnak in Waset. Khmer had good political relations with both China and India for centuries. However, not good enough. The destruction of African civilizations are sad, but none more tragic than what happened on the tiny island of Tasmania.
The event that began the slow collapse of the missionaries' vision took place in a then little-known outpost of Britain's vast and expanding empire. This is Tasmania, on the southern coast of Australia. What the British did on this small island was to resonate down through the Victorian age. When the British started to settle in Tasmania in 1803, they encountered the ancient Aboriginal peoples of the island. Only 5,000 strong, they had lived in complete isolation for 10,000 years, on the very edge of the habitable world. The settlers saw these people through ideas brought with them from Europe.
Quite early, you get expressions of disgust and shock about the way the Tasmanians lived. To the Europeans, it appeared that the Tasmanians were without culture, they were without religion, they were godless, So they looked upon the Tasmanians as people who'd been left behind by history, and they also related to a very popular idea of the late 18th century, that is the great chain of being, that the various races of humankind were arranged in hierarchical order, and that the Tasmanians were uniquely savage and primitive, and therefore can be treated almost as animals.
The British set about building a new capital and settling the surrounding countryside, land that for millennia had been the prime hunting ground of the Aboriginals. Out in these fields and pastures, far from the control of the authorities, the settlers were free to displace and abuse the Aboriginals.
From the 1820s, huge amount of Aboriginal land has been taken up, and there is this enormous struggle between Aboriginal people and whites. Of course, it's very hard to document a lot of the settler violence because they know that it is against the law to kill Aboriginal people. They are being told that Aboriginal people are British subjects, but they certainly reveal in their diaries and journals the desire to kill Aboriginal people.
What became known as the Black War was a hidden conflict. The landscape itself was the only witness. The British settlers killed any Aboriginals they encountered. Whole groups were massacred. Kidnapping and rape became commonplace. The Aboriginals regularly attacked the settlers as they fought desperately to defend their land. And as the death toll rose, fear fused with hatred.
In such circumstances, it was very easy, on both sides no doubt, to regard the other side as being totally subhuman. I've got no doubt that the Aborigines thought the Europeans were people totally without morality or without any restraint. Equally, the Europeans slipped very quickly into a view that these people were animals and savages. So that conflict in such a racially divided society so easily tips over into an extreme feeling of hatred.
The death toll of the Black War had terrifying implications for the Tasmanian Aboriginals. The British, who arrived in ever-increasing numbers, could replace their dead. But the Aboriginals, only 5,000 strong before the war, could not. And by the end of the 1820s, they were at risk of being completely annihilated. The only man who had any hope of halting the violence was the colonial governor, George Arthur.
Now, the governor of Tasmania is an evangelical. He knows Wilberforce, and he is aware that his future and his reputation depends on how he deals with this problem above all else. Now, he's already been warned in the late 1820s by the British government that the rapidly declining numbers suggests that these people might be exterminated. And were this to happen, it would be an indelible stain on the reputation of the British Empire, but by implication it would be disastrous for his career.
Governor Arthur set out to save the Aboriginals from the violence of the settlers, and to convince them of his good intentions, he produced a poster that was attached to trees in their homelands. It showed a fantasy of interracial unity. The poster spoke of British justice, promising equality before the law. The white killer of an Aboriginal would be hanged. If an Aboriginal killed a settler, he would be hanged. The poster also propagated the lie that the British wanted to integrate with the Aboriginals. It was both a fiction and a complete failure, because out in the bush, the killings on both sides continued. And in 1830, Governor Arthur embarked upon a new policy. He ordered the army to sweep across the area of European settlement in an attempt to capture the remaining Aboriginals. He offered a bounty for every Aboriginal taken alive, but the operation was a complete failure. Only 2 were captured, an old man and a young boy. After years of guerrilla warfare, the last few hundred of the original 5,000 Aboriginals had learnt to hide themselves in the bush. Determined to save them and determined to take their land for white settlement, Governor Arthur changed tactics. He now turned away from the army and looked instead to a missionary, George Augustus Robinson. He was the leader of a band of Aboriginal converts and was now hired to go into the bush and bring in the remaining Aboriginals.
Robinson took a message that the government wanted to come to some sort of an agreement, a negotiation, a peace treaty. And that is, I believe, undoubtedly the way the Aborigines saw it. They too saw this as a way to end a conflict which they had realised they could never win. They could never get rid of the Europeans. If they stayed and fought, they would be wiped out. And Robinson and his intermediaries convinced them that they should temporarily go to an island where they will be looked after and fed, and that they will ultimately come back to their homelands.
The island was called Flinders Island, and 300 Tasmanian Aboriginals who had been collected by Robinson were transported here. Robinson came with them in the official role of Chief Protector of Aboriginals, a job for which he was paid a total of £8,000, a small fortune in the 1830s. A settlement was constructed for them, complete with houses, farmland and a chapel. Robinson called it Point Civilization, and a local artist was brought in to paint the portraits of the last of the Tasmanians. Ginny had been captured by Robinson following the near annihilation of her people by the settlers. Wuradi had been a chief until his community had been wiped out by a European virus. Another local leader, Manalagena, had been lured to Flinders Island with the promise that the convicts who had attacked his people would be brought to justice. And there was Truganini, whose husband had been murdered in front of her. All of them had seen their culture almost wiped out.
When you read the European philosophers, what did they say? They often said that Africa had 2 great civilizations, Egypt in the north and Asia in the south. The white man said this. So they often, in ancient times, Asia was considered a part of Africa, or Africa's second civilization. They said that you go to Asia and it's nothing but a carbon copy of Africa because it was settled by the Africans.
A lot of people don't know that there are pyramids all over Asia, and there are pyramids in China. In Japan, they have an underwater pyramid that a lot of people don't know about, and you can go there now, and that's one of those ancient mysteries. But again, pyramids are all over the planet.
So in Asia today, you have pockets of black people. You have the Mani. You have in southern Thailand. You have a related group in northern Malaysia, sometimes called Sakai, S-E-K-A-I. You have the Andaman Islanders, and there are at least 2 groups. One group is called the Onge, O-N-G-E, or O-N-J-E, I think it's O-N-G-E, and another is called the Jawara, J-A-R-A-W-A. And then you have black populations in the Philippines, sometimes called Negritos, or Eta, or I think we should call them Acta, which just means the people. You have a tradition of a similar group in Taiwan. These are the diminutive Africoids. These are the small blacks, similar in many ways to the Twa, or so-called pygmies in Central Africa. These are very, very ancient people who left Africa perhaps 60, 70, maybe 100,000 years ago and became isolated.
The Padang people, that's a group of people in Asia, and the women have these rings that they wear on their necks that's identical to an African tribe of women in East Africa who wear the same type of rings on their necks. So this just shows that the African-Asian connection is still there. They still carry on some of the African cultures and traditions in certain parts of Asia.
I once had a professor of mine working on my doctorate tell me that she went to Japan and they went into the mountains of Japan. Now, this isn't a conscious woman by most definitions, but she couldn't wait to come back and tell me this. She said, Umar, I was in Japan. We went up into the spiritual temples of Japan, and we sat down in one of the temples waiting for the priest to come out and teach us a little bit about what they believe and what they stand for. She said, Umar, they walked out of the temples and their skin was just as black as ours. They had gray afros because they were elders. Now, she said the phenotype looked like the modern Asian, but she said the skin was black and they had gray afros, hair standing up on top like Don King. And she said it totally overcame me. They sat down and they began to talk, and she said I couldn't believe these were black men. They were Japanese, but they were black men.
When I went over to Indonesia, I went there at night and I would see billboards of very light-skinned Asian Indonesian people. And then when I went to my hotel, I would go and watch these movies and I would see these very, again, light-skinned, pale-skinned Indonesian Asian people. But the next day when I went out into the streets of Indonesia, everybody was either my color or darker. I didn't see one person who looked like these people that were on the billboards and on television. So they would pick and choose and get the whitest looking Asian people to promote in the media over there. And when I walked around Indonesia, I saw people like jet black, dark. I ran into a couple of people with afros. I saw one Asian brother, full-blooded Asian guy with an afro, and I had to stop him. I said, brother, where are you from? And the brother was like, I'm from here, right here in Indonesia. So that African presence, that African phenotype is still throughout Asia to this day.
Look at the Buddha's hair. No Chinese person's hair looked like that. The Buddha has knotty hair. Every time you see the Buddha, his hair is knotted. Just a thought.
There's a painting called the Nambam painting of the Portuguese when they first go over to Japan. And when you look at this painting, the painting was made in around sometime in the 1500s, and it was the first eyewitness account of what they saw. Many of the Asian people there were dark-skinned, and half the people who were supposed to be Portuguese were dark-skinned.
There's a tradition begun by a man named Alexander Francis Chamberlain, at least in April 1914, in a publication called the Journal of Race Development. And I can quote him almost exactly. And he says, and even in far-off Japan, we can find traces of the ancient Negro. For when the Japanese armies in the 8th century, now here I'm paraphrasing, when the Japanese armies in the 8th century were fighting their traditional enemy, the Ainu, they were led by a famous Negro general named Sakanoye Tamura. And this man became the first shogun in Japanese history.
Also in Malaysia, when I went down to Malaysia, I went into the rainforest over there. And it's very difficult to get over to some of these spots. Some of these people there are very secluded. And because they're secluded, they were able to avoid many natural disasters, and they were also able to avoid invasions. So they didn't mix in with some of the invading forces, so they kept their same African phenotype. And if you go to Malaysia, there's a tribe called the Batek tribe, and they look like an African tribe. If you go there, they have woolly hair, African nose, lips, everything about these people looks like an African tribe.
One of the things we know about white supremacy and light-skin supremacy, because even when you look at Asia, even when you go to East India, they practice racism. Why? Because all of these places were colonized by the European and their culture infected the people. So one of the things that they do is they also have a tendency to do what? Hide the darker brother.
As a matter of fact, there was an incident that happened with Miss Fiji. They had the Miss World competition, and they chose this woman to be Miss Fiji. And Miss Fiji has more Europeanized features, and the people of Fiji spoke out against her. They weren't really trying to hate on her, but they said, look, this woman doesn't represent us. She doesn't look like us. She doesn't have our nose. She doesn't have our hair. And we're very proud of what we look like, and we want somebody to represent us. Because again, they were trying to use that Europeanized Miss Fiji to bring in tourism and not scare away tourists. But the people spoke out against her. And this just shows that many people around the world, they're proud of their Africoid features. One of the oldest groups of people to inhabit India were a group of black-skinned people called the Dravidians, or the Untouchables. Now, when people think about the history and the culture of India, they oftentimes think of Mahatma Gandhi. And many people give praises and accolades to Mahatma Gandhi because of Dr. Martin Luther King. But what many people do not know is that Gandhi had very racist views towards black people.
The truth behind Mahatma Gandhi. First of all, I'm reluctant to use the word Mahatma. Mahatma means great soul. And many of my Indian colleagues would say he wasn't even an ordinary soul, much less a great soul.
The late, great Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. put that picture of Mahatma Gandhi up in his office and said that he got the operational technique for nonviolence from Mahatma Gandhi. It was somewhat premature for the ancestor, who's one of my favorites, but it was premature because now you automatically set the stage where African people would start looking to Mahatma Gandhi also. For example, last spring, last Black History Month, I was in Atlanta. I went to the Dr. Martin Luther King Shrine where he and Queen Mother Coretta are buried, and across the street is a museum. Outside the museum is a life-size statue of Mahatma Gandhi. I couldn't believe it. This is a museum dedicated to the honor of Dr. King. But there's no statue of Dr. King outside of a museum erected in his honor. Instead, you have a life-size statue of Mahatma Gandhi. So the message to the child is what? That it was really Mahatma Gandhi who's responsible for you coming through the civil rights struggle, not Dr. King. Now, had Dr. King knew Mahatma Gandhi's true racist thinking and ideology, I'm sure he would have thought otherwise. As a psychologist, you can never know what's really at the root of somebody's thinking. I would argue that we should never make a hero of any other people. Mahatma Gandhi turned his back on Africans. Even when he came back to India and began fighting, he refused to give support to the African emancipation movements. And on more than one occasion, he had made derogatory remarks about Africans. And we also know the Dravidians of India, the Africans of India who are oppressed, were oppressed, and have always been oppressed in India. There is no record anywhere of Mahatma Gandhi fighting against the oppression of Indians in India who were black, the so-called Dravidians. Why didn't he speak out for them? Why didn't he speak out for Africans who were fighting against colonialism? Why didn't Mahatma Gandhi help our brothers and sisters in South Africa? It's because he was a racist like the rest of them.
First of all, Australia itself is the world's second smallest continent, second only after Antarctica. It's the smallest inhabited continent. The name Australia means Great South Land. And the first people of Australia were the people we call Aboriginal Australians, commonly called blackfellas. And of course, you have different names, the Koori, the Goori, the Noongar, and various names.
The people of Australia, originally Australia was an African land. In fact, in European documentation, they considered it an African satellite. When the British came into Australia and began the mass extermination of African people, they were crystal clear who they were exterminating because they said it. And also we know that right off the coast of Australia was an island called Tasmania, a little island off the coast of Tasmania. There are no living Tasmanians in existence right now. You can't find a Tasmanian man, woman, or child because the British systematically exterminated the entire population.
It wasn't until January 1967 that Aboriginal people in Australia were considered humans for the first time. In January 1967, there was a national referendum to decide if Aboriginal Australians should have Australian citizenship. Up to that point, they were officially, and you can document this, classified as flora and fauna and plants and animals.
In Australia, they would literally breed out the melanin of the people. You know, they would have these, they would take the children and take them to breeding camps and breeding farms and breed the darker ones and the mulatto ones with white, and they would literally breed the melanin out of these people. The movie Rabbit Proof Fence is about that breeding process, them breeding out the melanin of the Aboriginal people. So it was very deep what was going on over there.
You have three major island chains: North Pacific, West Pacific, and South Pacific. Melanesia, Polynesia, Micronesia. Melanesia is the South Pacific. That means the Black Islands. And the biggest island is New Guinea. Others include New Caledonia, New Ireland, New Britain, Fiji, the Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, which used to be known as New Hebrides. These are the Black Islands. And the people that I've encountered in this part of the world tend to say they come from Africa. People tend to have very, very Africoid features: dark skin, tightly curled hair, you know, large afros, we call them today. Many of them say they come from Africa, especially in Fiji. And also in Buka Island. And I ask people, where do you come from? We come from Africa. And they're very matter-of-fact about it. Buka, B-U-K, means black skin. And they have the reputation of being the blackest human beings on earth. So quite naturally, that was where I wanted to lay my head. Look at images of King Kamehameha, and I know you have, who is what might be considered the founder of Hawaii. It's like the founding father of Hawaii. Clearly Africa.
One of the most famous Hawaiians is a guy named Duke Kahanamoku. Duke was one of the forefathers of modern surfing, and they would use Duke to promote tourism in Hawaii. They would send Duke to the continental United States to promote swimming in Hawaii and surfing, and Duke had problems getting into swimming areas when he came to the continental U.S. because people thought that he was black because he was so dark. And many of the native Hawaiians, they have that dark African phenotype. If you go to places like Maui and some of the remote areas of Hawaii, they look like black people, just like Samoans. You go to Samoa, they look like black people over here in America.
I'm doing an interview, a call-in thing, and somebody called in and says, you know, I'm a Hawaiian. And he says, the problem was you just didn't meet the right people. I said, really? He says, when I was a young boy, my grandmother used to tell me that when Kamehameha was trying to unite the Hawaiian Islands, this is around 1815, that he ran into trouble and he sent back to Africa for reinforcements. He said that was a Hawaiian tradition.
We have lived in Europe, we've lived in Asia, we've lived in the Americas. The African people have already proved that they can get along with different people, amalgamate their culture with different people without one hint of a war between them. People who come into Africa immediately declare war on African culture, standards of beauty, standards of conduct, and change the African concept of theirs so they can rule through him.
As for friends, you have had no friend. When they discovered you, they began to prey on you. Now let's look at our relationship with Western Asia, mistakenly called the Middle East. For 3,000 years, our greatest enemies came from Western Asia. They were trying to avenge the fact that they were once African colonies. We created peaceful nations that had no word for jail because no one had ever gone to one. No word for old people's home because no one ever threw away grandma and grandpa. No word for orphanage. We did all of this, and over half of human civilization was over before we knew that a European was in the world. Before he wore a shoe or lived in a house that had a window. Now, Africa has always and still is the prize for the whole world. We as a people have always been the world's richest people, culturally rich, mineral rich. We have always been the prize because we have always had and still have something that other people won't, think they can't do without, and don't care to pay for. Because we have always been the prize, we have been under siege for over 3,000 years. Nothing that ever brought into Africa from the outside was meant to do the Africans any good. That means all other religions. Islam was the handmaiden of Arab imperialism. Christianity was the handmaiden of European imperialism. The Hebrew faith was the handmaiden of a concept called the chosen people. Now, if God is kind and God is merciful and God has no stepchildren, he won't choose one over the other. And to say he chose some people, you're making him a bigot. And to say that he endorsed enslavement of one people over the other, you're making him an accessory to murder. And what we have to understand now, in the period of superior brainwashing, is there is no European answer for African problems. Either Africans find a solution to African problems, or there is no solution, and if you don't find a solution soon, you go back into slavery.